I want to introduce myself, actually introduce the hosts of this event here tonight. My name is Steven Renderos. I'm the national organizer at the Center for Media Justice. We're an organization that's based out of Oakland, California. Basically, the work that we do, we believe that the right to communicate belongs to everyone. And the right to communicate and therefore transform our society belongs to everyone. And we coordinate a national network called the Media Action Grassroots Network that's about 170 organizations across the country. There's some magnet members here in the room tonight. And we engage this network and build out this network to build leadership so that we can advocate for the type of media systems that we want to see in our society. I'm pleased to be co-hosting this event tonight, Enemies of the State, Government Surveillance in Communities of Color, along with Free Press. Collectively, we actually run a project called Voices for Inner Freedom, and I believe Joe is going to tell you a little bit more about that. But this event, which is really about highlighting the relationship between communities of color and government surveillance, and really detailing the full history, that this is a history that's been ongoing for a long time, is really part of a much larger discussion that's been happening more recently as a result of the revelations that the NSA has been engaging in unfettered domestic surveillance. We really needed to create an opportunity, or wanted to create an opportunity for this discussion about how this issue impacts communities of color specifically. And it does in very concrete and very real ways. We wanted to create a space for that discussion to happen, and we're happy that it's happening here tonight. This is part of a much larger set of events that's happening over the next few days that's culminating in a large rally here in Washington, D.C. called the Rally Against Mass Surveillance. It's being hosted by the Stop Watching Us Coalition, and a lot of the organizations in this room are part of those efforts. So I want to pass it to Joe, who's our co-host, but thank you all for being here tonight, and look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for being here. My name is Joseph Torres, and I work for the public interest group Free Press. I'm also a board member of the Center for Media Justice. Free Press, just a little bit about Free Press. Free Press, we're a public interest group that we fight for media and telecom policy to serve a public interest. We don't take any corporate money. We're funded through foundations and individuals. As Stephen said, Voices of Internet Freedom is a network. This is co-hosted as well with Voices of Internet Freedom. That is a network of 30 organizations representing the interests of people of color that includes Presente.org and Color of Change and National Hispanic Media Coalition and the Media Mobilizing Project, which is actually filming this event tonight. And they're part of Magnet. They're a Magnet member. So let me introduce Jared. So Jared is the moderator tonight. And first of all, I want to thank all the panelists for being here, especially the panelists who came from out of town. There's 3 of them who came from out of town. So Dr. Jared Ball is an associate professor of communication studies at Morgan State University in Baltimore. He is also the author of I Mix What I Like, a mixtape manifesto that came out in 2011. He is co-editor of A Lie of Reinvention, corrected Manny Mirabel's Malcolm X. And he also can be found on I Mix What I Like online, mixwhatilike.org, which I visit all the time to hear his, he's also a host here at PFW of a show that comes on Fridays, the Super Soul Funky Power Hour, something like that.
Super Funky Soul Power.
There you go. There you go. And he has great guests all the time, like the folks on stage. And so I urge you to visit his website and listen to his interviews. So with that, we'll just get into it. And Jared, it's all yours.
All right, thank you very much. First of all, thanks to the organizers of this event. Thanks to all of those who have come out to join us this evening. And of course, thanks to our panelists, who I'm going to introduce here in just a moment. Let me start with the introductions from my far right, and that is Fahd Ahmed, who came to the United States as an undocumented immigrant from Pakistan in 1991 and went on to attend Vanderbilt University and CUNY School of Law. Fahd joined Drum in 2000 when he had family members facing deportations, and within Drum, Fahd led the work with Muslim, Arab, and South Asian immigrants detainees before and immediately after 9/11. By coordinating before work immediately after 9/11, coordinating the detainee visitation program, Fahd was a recipient of the Haywood Burns Fellowship from the National Lawyers Guild and served as an Ella Baker intern at the Center for Constitutional Rights as a legal consultant with Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana.
Sure.
Yes.
Well, that's not relevant.
I don't need to read all that?
No, that's...
All right, well, Fahd Ahmed, everybody. To his left is Adwoa Masozi, who works with the Bill of Rights Defense Committee and
Masozi.
Masozi,
Adwoa.
thank you for the correction. Thank you for the correction. Who works with the Bill of Rights Defense Committee and is communications specialist and organizer and media activist in the Washington, D.C. area, where she supports efforts that reduce the collateral impact of incarceration on individuals and their families, protects public education, and creates pathways out of poverty. To her left is Alfredo Lopez, and Alfredo is a longtime veteran activist, now with May 1st, and has worked on many campaigns around the wide range of issues, including anti-privatization of hospitals, labor rights for workfare workers, and anti-repression and anti-racism campaigns. And I've seen some his work through video, where he talks a little bit about the importance of the internet, and I'll be asking him about that in just a moment. And to his left is Sister Seema, who is an organizer, filmmaker, lawyer, who uses art and media as a vehicle for social transformation. She, along with DC North Star Productions, produced several documentary films, including projects focused on indigenous peoples, public property, political prisoners in the United States, and the erosion of civil liberties. She is currently a member of the Maryland State Bar and organizer for the ACLU of the nation's capital. And finally, but not, last but not least, to my immediate right is Dhoruba Bin-Wahad, who, among many other things, was a member of the Black Panther Party, a co-founder of the Black Liberation Army, a member of the Panther 21, and as I've said before and will continue to say, is I think one of our brightest intellects and political analysts of our time. So I want to just ask everybody for their initial response to the more recent revelations over the NSA and its sort of global wiretapping. And as with this is a panel ultimately about the question of enemies of government and surveillance of people of color, or at least as I like to say, so-called people of color. How have you all seen this? Fahd, let's start with you. How do you respond, or what do you think is an appropriate response to these latest revelations?
I want to start by acknowledging the lands on which we stand, which are occupied lands of the indigenous peoples. Just by the very nature of it being a settler colonial nation, being a capitalist nation, race and social control are central to the project. So anytime we see any levels of policing, whether it's day-to-day policing in the streets, whether it's surveillance by the police, or whether it's internet surveillance, social control, and particularly social control of those that resist the existing system, becomes an inherent part of that system. So as the NSA spying revelations have been coming out, we've just been making the link. Obviously, we organize in the working class South Asian community, most of whom are Muslim. We've been making the link saying that these policies are not going to be limited to one particular community, and that they're going to continue to expand further and further, but that it's not just sort of passive surveillance. It's not just kind of, they're just trying to watch everybody. The surveillance has a purpose, which is to exert the power of the state, which is to control people, and in particular to control potential for dissent that may come out of communities.
How would anyone else like to respond to that? Just go in order, that's fine.
Okay. What we're experiencing now with the NSA is not anything new, as Fahd just so beautifully articulated. Thank you. What Fahd so beautifully articulated. What was done under COINTELPRO, which was considered illegal, has now been made legal through the USA Patriot Act and through the FISA amendments of 2008 and 2012. The government now is openly telling us that we are going to read your emails. Emails, we didn't have that conversation about emails back in the 60s and the 70s and even before the 50s, 40s. I mean, the government has been surveilling communities that resist, the state, as far back as, the 1900s with I think it was the socialist groups of the 1900s and the communist groups, also rounding up people who were resisting being drafted into World War I, a lot of young people. So all of this has been going on for a very long time, and now the government is just more open about it, though they didn't want to. Snowden helped with that. But this is something that isn't new to this country. And I think all that we can do is continue to sort of organize in our communities, because this is something that goes beyond, American politics. It goes beyond American borders, if we want to call it that. It is global, and it's going to require a global response and an organization between communities around the world.
I agree with everything that's been. In fact, I agree with everything everybody's going to say, and everything. It's all in the family. Nobody going to be having any differences. We're all in the family. But I want to point something out about this. These NSA revelations, they represent an increment in in the foundation that's been laid, and for some very good reasons. First of all, the ruling class is trying to figure out how it's going to govern in a society that is fundamentally changing and collapsing very, very rapidly. That's number one. 25 million people that are out of work, they are not going to find jobs. There's going to be an increasing amount of struggle throughout the world and in the United States. They got to figure out a way to put together the kind of police state apparatus that they can generalize through society. And in doing this, they do it a couple of ways. First of all, they do it with increased cooperation between corporations and the government. It's always been that way. I mean, nobody's fooling anybody else. But the level of corporate and government relationship and collaboration with particularly the Snowden revelations is unbelievable. I have never seen it, and I've been in this struggle nearly 50 years. So I have never seen anything quite like it. It even shocked me. The second thing, and this is very, very important, this comes at a period where there is an increase or it's a rise in the level of leadership of struggles by people of color in this country. And where the major struggles that are going on are led, at least partly, and in some cases, completely, by global majority people. That's very dangerous for the ruling class of this country. And I mean, I know Dhoruba and I don't even know if we've ever met, but we certainly rode with the same kind of people back in the day. And, I was telling somebody that since the 1970s, when they put me on enemies list, I couldn't get a passport till Obama got into the presidency. That's the level of surveillance and repression that existed. Well, that kind of apparatus is being generalized because they cannot allow struggles to be led by people of color in this country. Once you do that, you incorporate 85% of the population of the world in your struggles and in your leadership. So that's the kind of police state apparatus that's placed into, and the reason why they're going to do it. And I think that's the lesson. The question for us is how we, and particularly activists of color, respond to that, and how we're careful of that, and what some of the trends are. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah, I agree with everything they said as well. But, I haven't been around a long time. I've only been doing this work for just over a decade. But I think that one thing, observing from my position at the ACLU and a member of the community here, is I think that the Snowden revelations really represent a terrifying moment for white people in this country. Not just white people, but middle-class people, upper-middle-class people, people who, essentially, on some level, consciously or subconsciously believed in the document, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution, and believed that these were realities that were protecting their everyday lives. And for people of color, particularly people who come from communities with a history of discrimination, with a history of being surveilled, with a history of second-class citizenship, with a history of the type of economic, oppression that prevents one from realizing any of those rights on a day-to-day day-to-day basis, I think it was a little annoying and frustrating. Like, I told you so. I told you they've been listening to all our phone calls. Like, it wasn't a huge surprise. But I do think that this has particular concerns for people of color, communities of color, and in particular here in the district, Black communities and Latino communities. And that's because of the unique relationship to the criminal justice system or the social control system, which in the name of law seeks to control communities through policing and surveillance and law. And so I think that there are a lot of specific ways in which surveillance will be applied to further and strengthen the criminal justice system as it's applied to people of color, because this is a billion-dollar industry here in this country. And so we see that with regards to Border Patrol, we see that with regards to the sort of data mining that's going on and how it's specifically applied to racially profile. And all of that is happening in the context, this aggressive, blanket, indiscriminate surveillance of all people, this collection of information, which I'm quite sure they're not even, the government isn't even quite sure what to do with all this information. But all of that is happening in the context of stop and frisk. And why are they related? Well, they're related because of the Fourth Amendment. This sort of core value that was supposed to protect us from unreasonable government searches and seizure. Now, if you're a person of color or you live in a community of color, you know that that's not a reality in communities of color. We didn't need the stop and frisk case to know that every day young Black men are getting thrown against the pavement, thrown against aggressive physical encounters. We're not talking about, clouds of suspicion. We're talking about faces to the concrete. And so that sort of targeted racial profiling is happening in the context where we have this sort of wide-scale profiling of entire communities across the country. So I think the surveillance issue is a problem for all Americans. It's something we should all be concerned about, but it's of particular concern to communities of color.
First of all, I just want to say everybody done said everything I had to say. So I think that right now we're at a historical moment in terms of American empire, in terms of the geopolitics of globalization or international capitalism and finance capital. And I think that one of the things that we have to really come away from with these types of forums is understanding that the United States has moved into a full garrison state modality. It's a police state. I call it democratic fascism. And the reason why I call it democratic fascism is because of what he said, the marriage of the corporate, of corporate interest, the privatization of war, the rolling back of basic civil rights under the guise and pretext of protecting people from terrorism. I think our major objective, as I was explaining to some folks here, is that we have to put together an international movement to check the development and evolution of the modern national security state. The national security state, the Western national security state, of which the United States is the foremost model, has been exported, has been institutionalized in all over the globe. We could look at it in terms of how the United States and Israel, for instance, collaborates on policing methods and human mapping methods, how they've been involved with the NYPD, passing on information on how to map communities from their experience with the Palestinian peoples. We understand long-term incarceration as a mechanism and a tool of state torture for unemployed, for surplus labor, for surplus laborers. We had 35,000 inmates on strike in California, a hunger strike. And while they're on strike in California, we have inmates, prisoners in Guantanamo who are being force-fed. We have these same conditions in the prisons in Israel. We have the same conditions in the prisons in some of these South American dictatorships, autocratic regimes. We see how the U.S. is using humanitarian motives to intervene and change governments, especially in Africa. And I think that the world is ripe right now. We have to bring together the the disparate movements that are anti-globalization, the people who are about empowering the poor, who understand what the discrimination and genocide of Native people has resulted in. As the brother first pointed out, all of these nations in the Western Hemisphere that have got on board with this war on terror were European settler states. And as the basis and the raison d'etre of their establishment was white supremacy. And the white supremacy that has institutionalized itself within these nation states has created the type of atmosphere that we live in today. The type of atmosphere where poor people, poor whites, are against health care that would benefit them. That we look at the privatization of war as something that's beneficial. You know, the drones are coming into our community now. Law enforcement is using them. So these types of realities are shared by national minorities all over the world. In France, Muslims are under the same type of pressure and discrimination to conform with French culture as they are in New York. So my thing is, I think that we could open up discussion here on how we can move our movements forward into some type of functional front, so that we can convene an international conference on torture and state-sponsored terrorism and long-term incarceration as an aspect of torture. I think that we have to use these forums as a means to forge this type of solidarity and this type of principle unity. So I'm glad to be here and be able to discuss these things with progressive people. Thank you.
Do any of you have any responses or questions for anyone else on the panel in response or to what they've said? Anybody want to follow up with anybody before I throw out another question?
To make some of the things concrete, the idea of what finance capitalism means, we have to understand exactly what kind of economic system we're living in. Sometimes we think that the issue of our declining education, declining jobs, declining healthcare is a separate issue, and those people are not related to the folks that are working on policing and surveillance. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that those things are critically integrated. It's because capitalism is deciding to move to finance capitalism, which requires no real jobs, no manufacturing jobs, at least not domestically, that people are created as unemployed, education is not needed, and all you do is push people in the school-to-prison pipeline, school starts to prepare them for prisons, or prepares them to become low-wage service workers. And all the people that are left over, those are the people that the police and the surveillance and the military move into control. Mm-hmm. The military tries to take them to lead the wars abroad, and the police tries to control them in their streets, in their communities, and through prisons. And we have to understand these connections, and we do a disservice to ourselves when we compartmentalize our issues and our struggles from each other.
You know, some of us, myself included, are very skeptical about the potential good use or the potential positive impact that new media technology like the internet and specifically social media can have on our movements. But Alfredo, I saw that you said something that was actually kind of compelling to me. About how you saw the potential use of the internet and what you thought those of us on the left, or how you were framing the use of the internet and what you were saying or suggesting that those of us on the left see as the potential value of the internet. And so, but you know, so given what the internet is doing in terms of aiding surveillance and other kinds of military technology, what do you say to those of us who are again skeptical of its value to our causes up here?
First of all, I say it's ours. We created it. Capitalism has never created a damn creative thing in its entire history. The only thing it created was a time clock. Right? It's stolen all ideas. We created this. I remember when people were working on it. I remember when it was launched, and I remember what the ideas and the ideology behind it was. And the ideology was, even those who weren't political clearly had a perspective that this was a model for the way the human race can work together to produce things. And it still is the case. Most, people talk about corporate-owned software. Most of the software you use on the internet and the software that drives the internet at server level, which is where I work, that's all free and open source. People work on it. collaborate worldwide freely and openly. You can see the source code for it all, the programming that makes the thing run. You can share it, you can change it, you can do all of that stuff. It's when capitalists decided to exploit that labor, as they have done every single creative thing the human race has ever done, that's when it becomes polluted. And we have to fight that back. And there are some ways that we can do that. I mean, we have to regain that control. We have to regain that ownership. First of all, realizing we created it. I remember when the World Wide Web was developed, half the people in the World Wide Web developing it were left-wing people, were progressive people, half of them, easily. They understood it that way. And you can see the potential. There's nobody in this room who doesn't use the internet. And most of the organizations that work on the internet, work in the left-wing movement, progressive movement in the country, worldwide, they use the internet. They also can communicate. I remember when, I was going to say I'm aging myself, but no, in 68, I remember Dhoruba, in 68, the whole world went up. There was revolution all over the place. And we were here struggling. We were struggling in the United States, the student movement, people at community level, et cetera. We had no idea of the scope of the revolutionary fervor that the world had gotten into. Had we had that idea, we would have a different history today. And they hid it from us by the manipulation of the media. They can no longer do that because we have the internet. And that's something we need to preserve. And how do we preserve it? Well, one of the things we have to do is how that they have mapped it. That's why I say it's so important. I'm going on and on, forgive me. But one of the things that is important about movements of color, global majority movements, is they have mapped the surveillance to what we use as software. For example, what email program do you use? If you use Google Mail, Gmail, they got all of your information. They have captured every single word you have written, every single word you have received. And it's not necessary to use that. And so we need to begin making choices about that based on our ownership, believing you have no right to control our data, you have no right to control our ideas.
I'm really glad you mentioned that because, there was a time in right after the Second Imperial War, the World War II, when ignorance was bliss, when what you didn't know, couldn't hurt you. Now what you don't know will get you killed. And that means that we have approached the point in civilization, especially in terms of technology, where information is intelligence. And information is the basis for determining phenomena now. There's so much information out there that people are afraid to even look for stuff nowadays. It's just too much, it's too mind-boggling. It's like going into a supermarket and having 500 different choices for bleach. And unless you're wedded to a corporate logo, from history, my mama used to use Clorox, so I'm going to get Clorox, okay? You wouldn't have a clue about which one is better than the other. So information is out there. And what I think he's pointing out is that they have taken this information, they have taken the process of gathering information and it's twisted it in such a way that we have arrived at the level of oversaturation and skepticism. So that when somebody says something, that's another conspiracy theory. Yeah, what's new? You see, we've become blasé. Back in the days when we had to make leaflets off stencil machines and we had to do this work by hand and stay up 3 o'clock in the morning to get a leaflet out, we were dealing with a face-to-face relationship with struggle. And what he pointed out was the same thing that happened with the slave trade and colonialism. If the Africans knew what the British were doing in India, at the same time that they was doing it in Africa, we would have a whole different history, okay? Now we have the internet and we know what government is doing across the board, globally. We know about the massive surveillance. We know about the disruption of movements. We know about setting up proxy movements and encapsulated struggles. We know about ruling elites and deep state interests that undermine true democracy and true liberties and freedom. So I think it's very important to understand that the information age that we have today, this global village that we have today, is both a curse and a blessing. And we have to develop information warriors just as the corporate establishment has developed information warriors. This is one of the reasons why I think Snowden and Manning and those types of young men and activists are heroes. And they are people that we should support because they have revealed to us the extent to which we have permitted the state to take control of our access to information and our ability to educate ourselves and relate to each other.
I was thinking about, the famed late great Professor Derek Bell once said that something to the effect that freedom of speech is time specific. And I'm wondering how you all see the role of law and the role of those within the legal world. What role do they have to play in all of this? Or what role should be played? Or even more generally speaking, what is the philosophy of law as it should be applied to these concerns, or as you all experience it in the work that you do?
That's a really broad question, so I'm just going to answer it to the degree that I'm capable. But no, I don't think that the idea of free press at its core, the protection of the First Amendment is a sort of dated concept. Do I think that we need to reinterpret the Bill of Rights, the rights that protect people from intrusion by the government? Absolutely. I'll just give you an example. This is an unscientific example. I was talking to my eldest daughter, my partner and I, because she was getting an Instagram, and we were giving her this really long lecture about how long her life was going to be and how anything she put on there would follow her around for the rest of her life, and we really didn't want her to put stupid pictures of herself up on the internet because one day she might have a job or she might be a serious person. So we had this whole conversation, and she just stared at us, and she was just like, you guys are lame, and she just sat quietly. And then about 45 minutes later, I checked her Instagram, and there were 12 selfies from like every angle. And I was like, what? We just had this conversation. So I mean, all that to say that this is an intelligent child. This is a child that's sensitive. But the fact of the matter is that the generation that is growing up with social media is fundamentally, their sense of self is different. One more example, quick, unscientific example. They have this thing called uvu. By a show of hands, how many people use uvu? See, one person in the back, and he looks really young. And uvu is a group video chat. So kids today, this is a popular thing. They use uvu. They don't call each other and like, hey, are you free? I'll call you on the video chat. They just do it. They just hit you with it and pop up on your screen like 4 of them all at the same time. So you see, to me, that's egregious. I don't, I even prefer text or beat me or something. Like, let me know we're going to talk. But for people in this generation, their ideas about privacy are different, okay? So what is myself and what is the rest of the world? Where does my sort of internal monologue begin and stream of consciousness into the universe end? And if we don't acknowledge that, then we are being ignorant, and we are going to be irrelevant to the generation coming up. And so that's why we need to evolve our jurisprudence, our legal understanding of these various rights to adapt to the world that we live in. Okay, that being said, I see Sandy Fulton and Mike German sitting here, and every time I look at them, they're from our National Security Office. Every time I look at them, I keep thinking about this case. There's a recent case here in DC, and I'm gonna just give you a quick example of how social media as a neutral tool can be used against the government. And many of you would have heard about this. Jeff Light is a local attorney, and somebody approached him and said, hey, I think one of the people who's been protesting in our group, this is local, this is in the past few months, is an agent, an informant, a provocateur. And so he was like, okay, so he took the person and he did some, basically like Google stalking and Facebook stalking. Don't act like y'all don't know what I'm talking about. And so they have this they have some kind of technology where when you tag yourself in the picture, you're basically tagged forever, and they can take the compute this. This is new to me, but basically they can find you in any picture. So he did all this. He figured out where this woman's Twitter feed was. Why he went to this woman's Twitter feed and realized that she was tweeting from the protest, admitting to the fact that she was an agent. Now, so this is just an example of bad policing. Or if she wasn't actually, so there's this debate right now going on with regards to was she actually acting in the capacity as law enforcement. I don't even know why it's a debate, but whatever. So this is what the MPD is coming out with. But the point is, think about that. I mean, back in the day, and other folks who were actually there for this can talk about how the government was able to convince or to create sort of, questions of credibility within movements against one another. So in a sense, could the internet, could sort of this new idea of what self is and what transparency is all about, could that make us more powerful? Could that make us more powerful in the face of this sort of pervasive government surveillance?
Could I jump on this?
Just real quick, I'm sorry, because I want Adwoa to get a chance to respond.
So just jumping on the back of what Seema was saying about social media, privacy, young people, this generation does have a very different sense of what is private. Their sense of boundary, or I don't fully remove myself from this generation. I think I'm going to keep a toe in there. There's a very different sense with the advent of a very different sense of, who you are versus the rest of the world. And in the government, in this sort of social transition, the government has found a way to sort of exploit that vulnerability as we as a culture are redefining boundaries, redefining new norms, and establishing what is okay in terms of privacy. The government is using that information and in collecting that information. And unfortunately, I'm not a lawyer. I can't really speak to, I'm not a lawyer. I haven't really, given a great deal of thought to how the law, how lawyers can help in this situation. No offense to any lawyers. I'm sorry, Seema. Here, I've never had a good experience with the law. My family hasn't had a great experience with the law and the Constitution and what those rights mean. None of that has had a great deal of relevance coming up. It hasn't. And only as new revelations as to how the government has been abusing these rights that I never knew I had for a very long time did I, start paying more attention. And I don't mean to sound so, I don't know if that sounds terribly negative, but as I've come into this work of learning about surveillance, the rights that we have, it isn't taught. And I'm speaking about education. When I was a child, civics was not a subject that was taught in school. Rights was not something that we studied. It was something that was referred to. We understood it through the context of what the great founding fathers put together for us. But having it become something that's relevant to our experience and knowing how it applies to us and being empowered by the Constitution, being empowered by knowing that we have this thing that will protect us, this shield. That experience and that knowledge is something that escaped me and my brother as well, my whole family, for a very long time. And so even having this conversation right now, I'm learning just as I'm sitting here, because this is the first time really that in the last probably year or so that I've begun to sort of articulate these issues and find a language for it and think about it more critically because I'm affected. My family's affected. I have a new nephew and he is going to grow up in the surveillance state. He won't have a sense with the way the schools are. He's not going to have a sense of what was a society where surveillance was limited. Now it is a part. It is a part of it's going to be a part of his world. Social media, with social media, the internet, and how the government uses that. That's something that is going to become a norm if we don't adjust how our children are oriented to the Constitution, are oriented to the rights that are here to protect us, and also know the history of our movements, the movements that we're a part of. Like, that is something that did not come through public education. It came through my experiences with the law and how it affected the men in my family, and just thinking about that. So if I guess I'm trying to say that we have to change our curriculums and empower our young people. Beyond the conversations in our household, we have to have curriculums in schools that can make the Constitution relevant to our young people as they're growing up, or at least start new schools, freedom schools, something, community schools that can do these things. Because what exists now for young people to be oriented, it's dismal.
Two things around social media. I am one of those skeptics, and the only one thing I would add is, yes, we need to use it as a tool, but it cannot replace day-to-day flesh and blood organizing that takes place between human beings. There is a difference between a collection of 100 individuals and a collective of 100 people that have sat with each other, that know each other, that understand each other. And movements can only be built through collectives. It doesn't matter, you get like 2,000, like, okay, a bunch of individuals can pull off an action, but they can't run a movement. And that's one of the things that I want to just caution people about around, there's ways in which social media also builds communities, but you really can't substitute flesh and blood relationships. The second thing around the law. Law is inherently a conservative endeavor, just because it already sets limits, right? I think one of the, again, coming back to movements, one of the problems that we have in the US in particular is when you put lawyers in the leadership of movements. Right? Now I'm a lawyer, some of my best friends are lawyers, so it's not, but I mean, there's a reason that we have so many lawyers that are in the leadership of movements here, and our movements, let's be honest, are abysmal. And you go to third world countries, and there's poor people who may not even know how to read, but through the flesh and blood organizing, through relationship building, they are at the leadership of movements of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and of millions of people. And it creates, having a lawyer up, it automatically sets up a dynamic to where it's like, they know everything, I'm just going to sit back and let them lead us. Versus we really need to create movements that build the leadership of people from the bottom up, people that are directly affected, and the people that have the most to gain from overturning these unjust systems.
I just want to say one really quick thing, and then I'm going to give the mic to Dhoruba. First of all, I don't necessarily agree with that characterization of lawyers. I just had to put that out there. And here's why. I think that, law, I'm not talking about American jurisprudence or some other country or whatever. I'm just saying that the idea of thinking about sort of laws that govern a society, that's something I'm not an anarchist, so this is why I think this way. But I believe that for revolutionary movements, we need to have people who can think that way. And I think that it was my participation in revolutionary movements that made me think that our movements needed every type of thinker. We didn't just need rhetoric, we needed engineers and doctors and lawyers and, artists and sculptors and whatever. So I think that there's a place for everyone in our movements. And I think that our ideas about leadership need to be transformed. So we don't need to sort of just take the hierarchical approaches that capitalism has given to us and apply them to progressive movements or any type of movements. But all that being said, I do think that one sort of distinction in terms of how law should be practiced for being in alliance with movements as opposed to in the past. Today, information is no longer held in one person's hand, and information is power. While the use of force is still controlled by the state, they have the monopoly on the use of force. They don't have the monopoly on information that they once had. And I'm not saying that information is truly democratized as it should be. It's not. Neither is the internet. Not everybody gets a fair shot at adding their point of view on the internet. But, this idea that our power and our ability to transform the system really lies in our ability to capture that sort of decentralized power. I think there's something to that.
A sort of final question. I believe I saw Jonathan Stith walk in, who's the national organizer of the Malcolm X grassroots movement. And it reminded me of the report that organization put out last year. Every 28 hours, a black woman or man is killed by the police in this country. And the way I want to fold that into this final question for you all is what does that and these current issues of surveillance, even the title of this program, Enemies of the Government with a question mark, in relationship to so-called people of color or world's majority people, what do these things mean in terms, or as you all see it, in terms of how people of color, so-called, should organize amongst themselves? And what does this mean in terms of interracial organization with whites, as you all see it? What is the impact of all of that? And even again, the framing of this initial question of enemies of the government, people of color under the surveillance. How do you respond to that?
First, I just want to flash back to the notion that that the struggle for liberation, the struggle for an empowerment of ordinary people and working people is a struggle of legality. It's not a struggle of legality. There's been any movements, mass movements that were led by lawyers. In fact, the first people to get shot at the end of the revolution are lawyers. And as lawyers and as revolutionary representatives of those movements who make the law to shoot them. So I want to be practical. I think that we are living in a point in time where reform is important, but reform is predicated on revising and revisiting already standard laws and norms. That's what reform is about, making something better. You cannot make the national police state better. You cannot make democratic fascism better. You cannot reform white supremacy. You cannot undo the historical impetus that has been created by the European settler state with reform. What we need to build today on the knowledge that we have of the state is a new abolitionist movement. We need to build a movement to abolish the state and the legal frameworks of Western capitalism as it's now constituted. We don't need reform, but that doesn't mean that we don't have coalitions with reformers. That doesn't mean that reform that doesn't have a value. That doesn't mean, but it's not ours, shouldn't be our strategic vision. And that's very, very important to understand. We need a new abolitionist movement, just like there was a movement of abolition to abolish chattel slavery in this country before the Civil War that included progressive whites, that included people of color, that included ex-slaves and runaway slaves. That's what we need now. We got over 2.5 million people in prison, 10 million people, excess of 10 to 15 million people under some type of supervision of the state. We're dealing with a system that since Eisenhower left office has evolved into the national security state. If you don't understand that you can't reform this crap, you are in trouble. You can't, and this is the reason why I wrote an article recently about respect for the movements that the political prisoners come from. Because the movements that the political prisoners came from have been destroyed by the COINTELPRO and there's no more movement, what we have today is agenda-based activism. We have people that put political prisoners on their agenda, but they don't really support the political prisoners because the majority of political prisoners in the United States that came out of the black movement are in jail for killing cops. That's the bottom line. So unless you challenge the political power of the police to influence the parole and the institutions, unless you challenge that fundamental political power, you're not going to ever get them out of prison. So we have to understand right now that what we're talking about here is not reforming policing in America as we know it. We're talking about abolishing it as it's now constituted. Because what they're doing to reform it is to do what? Incorporate it. Is to privatize it, just like they privatized war. So the only antithesis of this privatization, incorporation of locking up surplus labor is a working class movement to abolish the system as it now stands. You know, I've known some of the most dynamic civil rights lawyers in my lifetime, from Bill Kunstler to Gerald Lufcourt to Lennox Hines. I mean, these were stalwart lawyers who stood on the front lines with movements, with revolutionary movements, with nationalist movements, with the civil rights movement. But they did not lead those movements. They provided the legal instrument to resist these movements when the political prisoners went to court. The Panther 21's defense wasn't determined by the lawyers. It was determined by the members in the Panther 21. So we need to understand that. When the National Lawyers Guild meets down in Florida today, and they talk about Assata Shakur and the Black Liberation Movement, who is talking about Assata Shakur? The people that's the keynote speakers on the Black Liberation Movement are lawyers. They know Assata Shakur from Adam's House Cat. So what I'm trying to say is there's no respect for the movement that Assata Shakur came from, because she would not be in Cuba if there wasn't a relationship between the Black Liberation Movement historically and the Cuban Revolution. There has always been that concrete relationship. There's been a relationship between Pan-Africanism and the Cuban movement and the Cuban Revolution in this hemisphere ever since Marcus Garvey. So we need to understand that our movements were legitimate. Our movements represented a radical tradition in America that's being sullied, that's being ignored, that's being rewritten right now, mainly by lawyers. So we need to understand this. We need a new abolitionist movement. If you're willing to step up to that task, then we can begin to dismantle some of this garrison state, or at least try to do it in a fundamental way.
Absolutely. I know I was asking you all that question, but as we move towards really coming up on Q&A, a lot of the questions are about how do we organize in this moment. If you don't mind, with your permission, unless anybody has something pressing, we can turn it over to that. Is that okay? How should we respond to people of color who attack us for protesting against all this spying, i.e. members of the Congressional Black Caucus that attacked Ed Snowden? This included Congressman Clyburn, commentator Julian Malveaux, etc.
Let me answer that. Listen. Black folks have understood ever since the bullwhip days that they are black enemies of black people. That white supremacy has been aided and abetted by those comprador elements in our community who perceive their vested interests in the status quo. That you have these bootlickers up in Congress right now, these same individuals that will allow, that you have these same individuals who would sanction Obama's the use of drones. They won't criticize them killing innocent women and children in the use of drones because they realize that Obama represents their interests. They have identified with the status quo. They have identified with the national security state. So they are class enemies of not only working people, but specifically of black people. So we shouldn't pay them too much mind. What we should really do is we should put pressure on them. For instance, what is the U.S. policy in Mali? What is the U.S. policy in Somalia? What is the U.S. policy in Africa? Them Negroes up in the Black Congressional Caucus can't answer that. We need to challenge them with that. We need to take our own fact-finding teams over there, present papers to these knuckleheads up there in Congress and say, what is Obama doing in Ghana? What are they doing in northern Nigeria? As we speak right now, U.S. Special Forces and drone operations have been operating in northern Nigeria for the past 3 years, past 36 months. Same thing with Somalia. They went in Somalia to snatch the head of al-Shabaab and got spanked and couldn't get him. They went into Libya and got the leader of a so-called Islamist movement. What we need to understand right now is those people up on Capitol Hill that have a melanin content are no better than those racists in the Tea Parties, than those reactionaries in the Tea Party, than the racists and reactionaries in AIPAC. We need to understand that our enemies are not necessarily those individuals who have a lighter skin than us. That's not the basis of our principal opposition. Obama is the worst thing that happened to black people since Reconstruction. And I call him the political antichrist. He's the political antichrist. And we need to understand this. And when we look at it, listen to Obama, when this charade that just went on, on Capitol Hill with the March on Washington and all the presidents were getting up there talking about the civil rights movement, Obama stood up and said that in the 60s, there was legitimate grievances against police brutality. But there were certain individuals that used those legitimate grievances for criminal activity. Now, who was he talking about? He was talking about the Black Panther Party, but he wouldn't say Black Panther Party, because if he did, that opens up the whole thing. Who was the real criminals? J. Edgar Hoover or the Black Panther Party? We have to understand that they are redefining the history of radical struggle in this country by denigrating our movements, by marginalizing our movements. And we have to resurrect those movements into a new coalition and with a new fervor to oppose the police state. So that's very, very important. And I think the lady or the person that was bored with the cards is absolutely right. We need to stop writing on cards and start writing on the foreheads of these Negroes up in Congress.
Are there any revelations, I think, related to the kill list that will be used on U.S. citizens in America?
I think they're talking about the so-called secret list that Obama's supposed to have.
I couldn't catch this word.
And I think that's related to the top 10 terrorists in the State Department's list of terrorist organizations. Right?
I think, there's a question on, people have been raising the question on whether weaponized drones would be used within U.S. soil. I don't think we've seen anything that clearly... We haven't seen anything, that sort of clearly indicates it, although I don't think it would be unexpected if it were to happen down the line. So one of the things to flag, though, is similar to kind of what Brother Dhoruba just pointed out around use of progressive language to promote neoliberal agendas and reactionary agendas. The immigration bill that's been pending in Congress right now, I also do immigrant rights work. We're an immigrant rights-based organization. But this bill actually sets the foundation for the massive expansion for the detention, the deportation, the surveillance, and the imprisonment of immigrants first, and then the monitoring of other people, society as a whole in the U.S. And one component of this is lots of money for the use of drones on the U.S.-Mexico border. The U.S. Border Patrol then has the freedom to utilize those drones anywhere within 100 miles of the border and any ports of entry. And I think by folks' calculations, that actually means 60 to 70% of the U.S. population that lives on the northern, eastern, western, and southern borders. Mm-hmm. And there's a question around how those drones would evolve in their use.
Okay. We have a number of questions that relate to internet security, use of the internet, encrypting emails, whether we should use LinkedIn and the social media.
The first thing to do is you cannot hide from those social media engines, etc., that compromise you. That is a reality of the situation. Everything that you put on Facebook is going to be collected by the government, because the government collects data through the NSA's relationship not only with these particular companies that put this software out, but also through a series of particular contracts, favorite company contracts, it's called, favorite partner contracts. They have 147 of them throughout the world. And in exchange for, getting a break on bids, etc., they give the government a bunch of stuff. They do stuff for the government. And, the data companies give them data. The second thing to remember is your data is not protected by the law. Why? Because it's not in the United States, man. When Clapper gets out there, James Clapper gets out there and says, we do not collect, or Brother President gets out there and says, no, we don't collect any of that. We wanted to talk, I love the thing where he says, we wanted to have a discussion about this, after Snowden came out with the revelations. And he said, we're not collecting any data, we're not, they run through that whole thing. Most of the data that's collected doesn't come from the United States because most servers that have that data aren't in the United States. The internet is a worldwide phenomenon. And so that's the problem you see with all the surveillance stuff that's coming up with the various countries. You can't hide from Facebook because there's so many people on Facebook. But you can be judicious and intelligent in the way you use it. And the same thing is true of streaming media. You need to stream media. There are alternatives to this, and you can start to use them. But when you have so many people that use this as a matter of their daily lives, it's impossible to hide from it. It's just to be judicious in the way that you use it in terms of your politics and organizing. Email's another question. Email, no, in my opinion, I'm sorry, because everybody up here is being, but like we're older generation, we can be a little bit more extreme. Nobody should use Gmail. Shouldn't use it, period. All right. Some people say, well, Alfredo, for this. No, you shouldn't use Gmail. Why? Because everything in Gmail is given to the government. That's why. Because Google is a favored partner. Right? Because the person who runs that is a major advisor to the President of the United States. Right? That's the technology advisor, is the Google guy. So you cannot expect them not to be giving information to the United States. They do it. There's no reason to use Gmail. There are a lot of alternatives. I run an alternative, but I'm not going to make no advertisements for my own organization, May 1st People Inc. There are many that do. The encryption issue is another issue. People, particularly movement activists, should get into the habit of using encryption for email, which is very easy to use. There was a recent scandal in which, as we know, the NSA got involved in, this stuff is all decided by all of these international bodies and stuff like that. The NSA infiltrated a bunch of those bodies, ended up in control of one of them. And those were the ones that wrote the standards for encryption, among other things. So the NSA was writing the encryption standards that are used in many email packages, etc. Still, encryption works when it is properly put together, and there are independent encryptions. Many people use pretty good privacy, PGB, English is my second language. That particular, we cannot vouch for that encryption program. There is an alternative called GPG, which is the one that I use. That is encryption that we believe works, and that can be, safely communicate your email. And you should try to use it. You should be working with that, working with various alternatives. I'd be happy to talk to people about what those alternatives are. The question is to have consciousness about this, because too many brothers and sisters, and this is particularly true of people, global majority people in charge of movements, don't think about this stuff. They get cynical. And they get cynical in part because of this privacy thing that our two sisters were talking about before. Listen, this is a really important thing. Privacy is not about your individual privacy. We want to preserve that. Privacy is about your ability to get together with a bunch of people and organize stuff that's going to oppose the government. That's privacy. And that's what we have to struggle against and try to preserve.
One question is, Fidel Castro was a lawyer. My question is, do you think after H.R. 347 that protests are the most effective means of change? And what happened to the most effective means of protest, which is boycotts? And I would again like to try to fold into this question my earlier question about what does all of this mean specifically for the ability of world's majority people to organize amongst themselves, and what do you think all this means in terms of organizing interracially with the global minority?
A boycott is merely a tool of struggle. It's merely an instrument of struggle. It's an expression of a movement's strength. You don't call a boycott when you have a weak movement and you say you're going to close down the city and the whole city's open. That's just telling the enemy that you're weak. A boycott is just like any other instrument or tool. But I want to say something. Yes, Fidel may have been a lawyer. So was Nelson Mandela. So was the founding members of the ANC. And we see where South Africa's at now, don't we? So The ANC was never a liberation movement. It only wanted to abolish the legal mechanisms of apartheid and give Africans full citizenship. It was never about the overthrow of the government initially. So we need to understand, again, it shows you the limitation of lawyers. I'm staying with them, so you know I love me some lawyers now. So, but I'm saying, all I'm trying to say is, all I'm trying to say is boycotts are good, but they're a consequence of mass organization. They're a consequence of effective coalitions. The bus boycott in Montgomery. Whenever we look at where a boycott succeeded, it was because it was a mass movement that was mobilized by people on the ground. Okay, so that should put a boycott in political perspective. It's a very useful tool in terms of struggles, but it's a consequence of organization. It is not organization in and of itself. Okay, and finally, I just want to add and drop here something that I think is very, very important. A lot of us fail to realize or fail to appreciate that the crisis that the United States is facing as an international power, domestically and internationally, is, as Fahd pointed out, directly connected. It's linked. Domestic policy in the United States drives U.S. diplomacy. White supremacy in the United States and the fight to keep white supremacy in control of the institutions of this country as the country becomes increasingly people of color is all manifested in immigrations. It's all manifested in U.S. policies towards Latin America. It's all manifested in U.S. policies towards Cuba, towards Africa. It's all manifested in U.S. policies towards Canada. When they talk about Canada, they talk about what? Unification. When they talk about Mexico, they talk about building a wall. So we need to understand that U.S. foreign policy is driven by its domestic concerns and its domestic policies. And this is very important for the anti-racist struggle and the empowerment struggle of national minorities. We have to understand our struggle is connected to the struggles of all oppressed people in this world. And they all suffer under the boot of an empire. The United States has over 700 bases around the world. And yet and still they want to challenge Iran as a threat to international peace. Iranians have no military bases outside of their territory. So how are they a threat to world peace? And the U.S. has 700 military bases around the world. So we need to understand how the parameters of the debate in media are defined by the information warriors of the state and of the corporations. Okay? We have to redefine the parameters of the debate. And that means we have to become more radical. We have to talk about an abolitionist movement.
Yeah, I just want to say something kind of broadly, and listening to Dhoruba is always educational for me. And I think that the title of this event, Enemies of the State, kind of reflects a lot of the sentiments that Dhoruba has been talking about, this idea that, you know, there essentially is a war going on. And it's interesting because at a community forum where we largely talked about racial profiling in Southeast 2 days ago, I heard very similar sentiments, this idea that the young men out on the streets were soldiers and they were at war with the state. And so obviously it's a real experience for many communities and for many people. And so I think in that context, this idea that this state, which is at war with the community, using surveillance, you know, in a sense, the only real option is to A, protect oneself, defensive strategies, and B, offensive strategies to surveil the state, to infiltrate. And so I think that's one approach. But from my perspective, I believe that there is, you know, there's a place for struggle like the one that we're talking about, but also reconstruction and creating the sort of laws and the sort of society that we would like to see. And when I look at surveillance in that context, in the context of reconstruction, reform you might call it, or reconstruction, what place does surveillance have? Should no one know anything about anyone else? Should everything be private? Are there moments where things shouldn't be private? The one thing that I think is similar between COINTELPRO and between the moment we're in today is this idea of no criminal predicate. And the same thing happens for young black men walking down the street in Southeast DC. There need not be any sort of criminality associated with their behavior, because simply their presence in a certain place at a certain time is sufficient, and is really a racial profiling to say that, their privacy should be violated. And similarly, I think that the sort of transformation that happened with the Patriot Act is this idea that you no longer needed to be committing any crime. You no longer almost needed to be committing a crime. And so I do think there are things to think about in broad senses, in terms of international solidarity with other movements, but also in terms of what fundamentally about our core values do these laws offend. It's not just about Facebook or Gmail. It's about some sense that one should be able to organize, one should be able to believe, one should be able to organize with other members of community to move society forward. And to what degree should any state, whether it be the government of the United States or the organizing structure in your political party, it doesn't matter. We should have ideas about to what degree those entities should be able to control our behavior. And I think that that's what this is fundamentally about. It's not just about, the internet. It's sort of like a struggle within society, especially society where there's such vast power differences in terms of who should control the movements and the activities and the thoughts and the ideas of others.
I want to link a couple of points and actually maybe slightly disagree with Brother Dhoruba. Actually, not so much a disagreement. So earlier on, he pointed out that we can't reform the police state, and I agree with that. But reformist struggles are important not as an end in themselves, but as a means. When our movements are so abysmal that we struggle to get a couple of hundred people out when somebody gets killed in our neighborhoods by the police, it means that our movements are weak. And I don't believe in spontaneous revolution. I don't think that one day people are going to wake up, they're going to hear some news, and people will be like, all right, let's go out there, let's do this. Movements have to be built. People have to learn and be taught how to be organized. And for that purpose, reformist struggles are very important. As long as, and this is very important, particularly for those that work in nonprofits, as long as you understand the limitations of the reformist struggle. You have to do the political so, you engage in campaigns. We're gonna bring this oversight law over the NYPD. We're gonna do this over the FBI. We're gonna do this around labor. But as long as we do the deeper political education with the masses of directly affected people, of working class communities, of women, of third world peoples, the world majorities, as has been talked about on the panel, that we do the deep political education, that yes, we're engaged in day-to-day bread and butter struggles, but our goal is much further beyond that.
I'll be brief about this, but I wanted to say something about, what we should do. One of the experiences that we have in May 1st People Inc. is we are organized in both the United States and Mexico. One of the few member organizations in the country that is. About 6 of our members are there. And so it's given us a good opportunity to feel the complexity of what that's all about. I think we have to tackle that. And I think as a movement, we have to begin to develop the idea of rejecting the concept of border, because border is an imperialist construct. It does not in any way benefit you. And to begin to deal with how we as a world discuss the redistribution of wealth, discuss the shared responsibility over climate, and discuss the generalized responsibility in terms of democratic behavior. What that means for the entire world. And I think we got to start doing that now. And I think we have to start thinking about that now. One good way to do it is through the internet, but that's not the only way to do it. That's not the only way. But I think that that's where we have to be thinking of. I think the movement in the United States is 2 United States. And so for the period. And I think we have to transcend that.
One is directed at Dhoruba, but anyone else obviously can respond. How is the $2 million bounty on Assata Shakur affecting the activist community? How can we occupy surveillance? When will the progressive legal community sue the FBI routinely? And could any of you speak to the lack of outrage or public outrage to the FISA court, NSA, and now the shutdown in context of the limits, in the context of limits imposed on us by these tyrants, and the public testing of docility?
In relationship to Asada, I recently wrote an article about that. I tried to point out, in fact, I got copies of it with me. It's called Asada Shakur, the Nightmare After the Dream. And the addition of Asada to the 10 most wanted terrorist list of the FBI was both a machination of the national police force, of police unions in the United States, opposition to the Obama's future reapproachment with Cuba. I mean, that's clear. I mean, part of that had to do with the U.S. adjusting its new policies in Latin America. Okay, to de-emphasize the war on drugs, militarism, as Obama said, and emphasize humanitarian aid and development in Latin America. This is to counter the so-called leftward trend in Latin America and the lack of U.S. hegemony in the region right now. So a part of it was directed at trying to modify the conditions of blockading the Cuban people. But it was addressed by law enforcement in the United States who politically opposes this, the right wing of law enforcement. And Asada is a symbol of this. You know, the State Department has been consistently pressured about Asada by the Law Enforcement's Benevolence Association, the Policemen's Benevolence Association, and American police unions. So Asada's placement as a terrorist was partly designed for the police to say, look, any type of rapprochement with Cuba, we have to consider these cop killers who are in exile and how that's going to play into any future diplomacy. But the most overarching thing was that the Obama Justice Department has sought and has continually sought since Obama became president to rewrite the civil rights movement, to rewrite the civil rights history, and to write out of the history of black people in this, the radical tradition, the role that Malcolm X played in the civil rights movement. Without a Malcolm, there wouldn't have been a Martin. Without the Black Panther Party and SNCC, there wouldn't have been no SCLC. It's effectiveness. There's a radical tradition in this country that goes all the way back to before the days of slavery, to Denmark Vesey and the slave rebellions. And this is the objective of this new black intelligentsia and academia and black bourgeoisie and these head Negroes in charge all over this country to rewrite this history, My wife is a teacher in public school. I'm gonna end with this. She just taught the children today in her first grade class. She mentioned Malcolm X. They all know Martin Luther King. They all know about his dream, but none of these kids, a lot of them are from Central America, from Latin America, who are black children in this school in Atlanta, know absolutely nothing about Malcolm X. So she showed a little 5-minute streaming video on Malcolm X, and the kids were shocked. They were amazed. They didn't know nothing about this. We need to understand that the reason why they have rewritten the history or trying to rewrite this history of the movement is because once we understand how we got to where we are at, we're able to dismantle and stop this process. We're able to challenge it. We cannot challenge it now because the right wing has consolidated its power in this country behind the law, behind the state, behind fear and of terrorism, to the point now where the left doesn't exist anymore. There's no real opposition to what's happening in this country. This is why I said it's very important for us to do what the people on this panel have said. We have to build a global movement for the redistribution of human rights.
I guess I disagree with the question. I don't think people are really apathetic about this. I mean, think about it. It's fundamentally, it's the same thing as if we're talking about the NSA surveillance, right? They're going through your emails, they're snooping on your phone calls. It's the same idea as if you're walking down the street and a cop stops you and empties out your pockets and searches your bags and reads what's in your phone. I mean, does that sound crazy? Because it happens every single day, all day in Black and brown communities. I mean, that's just status quo. And so when you talk about apathy, one of the most difficult things that I find as we do this work around racial profiling and police practices here in the district is not to get people to say that this is happening, because they say it all the time, but it's to get people to believe that they deserve something better, that there is actually a sort of way of living that is more humane. I mean, people know that it's undignified and it's inhumane, but to imagine that it's possible to actually change it. So I think that apathy is not what I would describe to talk about the NSA surveillance. I think it's the opposite. I think that when that Fourth Amendment right is attacked in white communities and upper middle class communities and communities which feel a sense of entitlement to experiencing their rights, I think that you have things like what we have this weekend, which is a massive demonstration here in DC. The Stop Watching Us coalition, organizations all across the country, and people are coming in to protest and to march. And it's not just about marching for the rights of the entitled people. But the truth is that sort of impetus, that sense of offense, the sense that your privacy has been violated and that's wrong and that you're entitled to more, it does come from an educated class of people and a generally entitled class of people who feel that. And I wish that sentiment, that sense of entitlement, that sense that we deserve a dignified existence in our communities as well, I wish that could also be a sentiment in our communities so that we could have the kind of movements that existed in this country 30 and 40 years ago. And so I hope that communities of color see that their interests are intimately involved in these rallies and these protests, and they're not the answer, but they can be used as a public education tool, especially when you have a place like the district where the police are actually actively sending in informants into various political groups. And so if they're sending them into the white groups, you already know if Black people try to organize in this city, there will most definitely be the strong possibility of similar types of informants. So we hope to see you all this weekend on Saturday.
I want to leave with 2 points. The first is the importance of mass-based organizing. I don't say that to mean that that's the only thing that we need, but if we look at American movements, it's the thing that we're the weakest on. We have good intellectuals, we have good people that have good understandings, but we lack mass movements. So we need to really commit to mass-based organizing, particularly of directly affected communities. So training young people that go to public schools and are being treated like they're going into jails when they go to school, training those youth on how to combat the systems that they're facing, how to speak up, how to fight back, how to speak at panels like these. Training people that are being targeted by the surveillance system, the Muslim families, people that are not only being pressured and intimidated, but the people whose kids are being set up into fake and manufactured terrorism plots. And they're serving 30 years and getting that mother to learn how to speak at a panel, at a rally, and tell her story, but also build bridges with other people. So doing mass-based organizing, which inherently, if you talk about directly affected people, means communities of color or third world peoples, it means working class people, it means women, and we really need to prioritize that. The second is, once you start doing mass-based organizing, is building solidarity. Now, there's 2 kinds of solidarity. One is conditional solidarity, on which we're very good at, which is, this is my issue, that's your issue, I support you, you support me. But we need to go beyond that. We need to understand our struggles as inherently being interlinked and being one. And the reason that I started with mass-based organizing is that you can only do that when you have mass bases of directly affected people interacting with other mass bases of directly affected people. So when the mother whose son is serving 30 years in prison sits down with the mother of Sean Bell, whose son is shot down in a hail of 50 bullets, that solidarity is very different than the intellectual connections that we can make on this panel. That solidarity is rooted in flesh and in blood. And those mothers will not sell each other out no matter what. And that's what we need our movements to do, that they're not going to look at their own self-interest and say, let me get this immigration bill, screw the people on the border, I want my papers. No, our people should be saying, I don't want your goddamn blood-tainted papers, and I will continue to be undocumented if it needs to be. I don't want your expanding police state if it means further targeting of my neighbor. That's the kind of solidarity we need to build, and it can only happen if we have mass spaces of people.
And just thank the panelists, and thank you everyone for being here. Appreciate it. Thank you guys.